On the way to the excavation site of a new metro section, we were accompanied only by dim flashlights. The noise from the operating equipment grew louder, echoing in the concrete walls of the tunnel. Strangely, there were no workers around, so there were only 3 of us. Myself, Neil, and our guide, a local foreman named Jake. Jake turned out to be a rather pleasant person. I noticed that often the most responsive people work in fields where interpersonal communication is minimal. Perhaps every time someone talks to them, they are so glad for the interaction that they give their all to the conversation. Jake enthusiastically and with lively gestures told us about what had happened, wondering how we had learned about the incident since they hadn't had time to inform anyone yet. Here's what happened. When the workers were digging the soil, they stumbled upon an ancient stone door adorned with writings and drawings. Putting in effort, they pushed it aside, revealing a gap large enough for a person to squeeze through. Then the bravest among them decided to check what was inside. However, literally a minute later, he jumped out saying that there was something alive in there. And he, by the way, did the right thing by running away immediately. As an expert, let me advise you, never explore what happened if something horrifying occurs. For example, if you see a pile of rags under which something with an unrecognizable limb protrudes, never ever check what's there. It's better to turn around 180 degrees and run away. Soon we reached a temporary wooden staircase installed along the shaft. Everything around was covered in a layer of dust and clay, reminding us of the seriousness and scale of the work being done here. Upon reaching the bottom of the tunnel, we found ourselves in a large open space where excavators and other heavy machinery stood idle. The air smelled of metal and earth. There was an unusual silence at the excavation site, as if all work had suddenly stopped. The only sign of life was a group of people standing in the corner, discussing something animatedly among themselves. When we approached, Jake shouted for everyone to disperse. The workers grumbled as they parted, clearing the way for us. Before us stood a granite wall with a massive stone door in the center, every square inch of which was skillfully carved and detailed. The door depicted angels with outstretched wings battling demonic figures, embodying the eternal struggle between good and evil. Angels, depicted in various battle poses with swords and shields, expressed determination and courage. Their faces radiated nobility and compassion, while the faces of the demons were distorted with anger and aggression, creating a sense of tense confrontation. Latin inscriptions were inscribed between the figures of angels and demons, possibly containing quotes from the Holy Scriptures or apocalyptic prophecies, executed in an elegant, ornate script. These texts seemed like prayers or incantations meant to empower the angels in their holy war. Decorative ornaments and symbols were carved around the door, possibly representing Christian virtues or spiritual elements, adding a layer of symbolism to the depicted battle scene. These ornaments could symbolize protection and the sacred mission entrusted to the angels. Neil approached closer and began to feel these symbols, murmuring something to himself. He stood there for a while, then turned to us with a frightened face and ordered everyone to leave this place. His reaction scared me because I had never seen him afraid of anything before. It seemed serious. Jake started commanding the workers to hurry up. There was murmuring and discontent, but everyone rushed to leave. I approached him and asked what had happened. He replied, "Apparently something dangerous is sealed here, and now we need to understand whether we woke up what was sleeping there or not." His voice was troubled. What could have been hidden there? While I examined the frescoes, Neil said he needed to make a call and headed upstairs. I stayed behind to guard the entrance. For some reason he didn't return. There was no communication underground, and I remained unaware. Wandering through the tunnel, I found a chair lying near a tent, and picking it up, I headed to the entrance to the catacombs. I got bored. I had already examined the frescoes and inscriptions, and no matter how much I looked at them, I couldn't understand anything useful. So, sitting on the chair, I took out my phone and started reading a book I had downloaded earlier. The story was quite interesting. At the point where the main character was fighting his enemy and the climax was about to happen, I heard a sound from the open gap of the door, which we still couldn't close. What's that? I looked around, no one was there. Listening carefully, I realized the sound was coming from inside the tomb. Turning on my flashlight, I quietly approached and directed the beam of light inside. Before me was an ancient room adorned with frescoes. On the opposite side stood two statues resembling angels guarding the entrance, which led to a long corridor. I don't know what was at the end of it. The beam of light didn't reach there. While inspecting the room, I passed the light past the corner, but then quickly returned. There was something in the corner. A figure resembling a human, naked, covered in some thick, rough skin, like stone. It was huddled in the corner with its back to me, and when the beam of light hit it, it turned irritably. The creature was hairless, with no nose, two large slits in its place. Its mouth was wide, with rows of large, sharp teeth. Its hands were huge, with long claws on its fingers. It was holding the remains of a rat that it had been gnawing on. Seeing this sight, I dropped the flashlight in shock, but quickly picked it up again and illuminated the room. But the creature was no longer there. It seems it went down that corridor. I recognized it. It was a ghoul. These creatures like to inhabit places where there are human corpses, feeding on them. It was my first time encountering one. Honestly, the sight was quite creepy. I took the safety off my gun, ready to defend myself. Neil still hadn't returned. Where the hell did he disappear to? Suddenly, I heard strange sounds from inside again. It was a clicking sound, and it was getting closer and closer to the door. I prepared my weapon, expecting it to emerge any moment, but it seemed that this creature, or whatever it was, decided to turn around and go back. I breathed a sigh of relief. It seems this place is indeed dangerous. After waiting for another half an hour, I finally saw my partner descending down the stairs, accompanied by a rather strange-looking man. He was dressed in a long cloak that reached down to the floor, wearing garlic head necklaces and a huge silver cross hanging down, probably the size of 2 palms. He had a peculiar hat adorned with various inscriptions. Behind the two of them walked a group of people dressed in black uniforms covered in scales, holding weapons. I recognized them as Titans, a special combat unit of our agency. As they approached me, the strange man immediately began examining the frescoes on the door. Looking at Neil, I nodded my head towards this odd character, silently asking who he was. Neil replied that he's our main vampire specialist, and his name is Chesterfield Grimsley. Though he looks and behaves oddly, he's a professional in his field. The man continued scrutinizing the fresco while I told Neil about encountering the ghoul. He nodded, saying that apparently we will encounter more creatures there. Soon Chesterfield, let's just call him Chester, finished examining the inscriptions and approached me, extending his hand to introduce himself. I awkwardly shook it, saying my name is Mike. He then said that this place is indeed dangerous, and it's possible that it's the work of the Order of Celestial Warriors. These guys only took on matters that could threaten all of humanity. But what's interesting is that this organization disappeared without a trace 40 years ago. No one knows what happened, but some say they might have perished fighting an unimaginably powerful foe. The question is, what did they seal in this place? That's what we were about to find out. Neil called for backup, so we'll be pushing forward with force. I was given a special rifle loaded with silver bullets, along with a couple of magazines. Armed, we approached the door, accompanied by 5 more Titans, while the rest were to guard the exit. Applying force, we shifted the stone slab and entered inside. No one was there. Then Neil led the way, and we passed by the stone statues of angels, entering the corridor. It was made of bricks of white granite and had an arched shape. Rodin and lizard bones littered the floor. As we walked along, we came across niches along the walls where busts of angels stood, some of which were broken. Soon, we encountered inscriptions made in blood. Some were written small, others covered the entire ceiling and walls. The inscriptions were in Latin, which unfortunately I hadn't yet learned. Neil said they were blasphemous curses written here and didn't bother translating them for me. Who could have left them, the ghoul? But they usually have very low intellect. We continued moving forward, occasionally stopping to listen to the surrounding sounds. Soon we reached a fork. The corridor split into 3 paths. Chester, whom we looked at for guidance, simply shrugged. Then Neil chose the far left passage without hesitation. Following him, we soon found ourselves in a large hall, with doors to various rooms lining the walls of the corridor. Extinguished candles stood on either side of the corridor, their wicks seeming to wait for sparks to ignite again. A strange, viscous atmosphere hung in the air, penetrating to the bone. Absolute darkness only intensified the feeling of unease, and I constantly expected someone to pounce on me from the dark corner. We began checking the rooms one by one, but most of them turned out to be empty. Soon Chester called us into one of them. As we entered, our eyes fell on a strange and ominous sight. A circle of skeletons kneeling. Each skeleton faced towards the center, where on a low stone pedestal lay a tarnished metal book, its pages turned towards the heavens, as if praying for something lost and irreplaceable. The light from our flashlights cast long shadows on the walls, making the skeletons seem alive, flickering in the light and shadow, as if they had just frozen in their prayers. The cobwebs covering their bones glinted in the light, adding even more sinister atmosphere to the scene. The room was silent, broken only by the scurrying of rats fleeing from the light and our footsteps. An indescribable sense of fear and foreboding permeated the air, as if something terrible had once happened in this place. Some of the skeletons still held remnants of rosaries or ancient amulets in their bony fingers, as if trying to protect their souls from the evil they encountered in their final prayer. Examining the room, we felt the empty eye sockets of the skeletons watching our every move, as if warning or forewarning of something dreadful to come. Chester approached the pedestal to examine the book, and after inspecting it, said that it simply filled with prayers. It seemed to have no significance, but he carefully covered it with cloth and put it into his backpack. After that, we left and continued our search. We approached the next door. Strange, disgusting sounds emanated from inside, reminiscent of wet suction cups attaching to a smooth surface. These sounds filled us with dread, making our hearts beat faster. Carefully, armed and ready, we prepared for the worst. As we slowly opened the door, we were met with a menacing sight. The room was shrouded in thick shadows, and in the dim light, the ceiling swarmed with hideous creatures. They resembled octopuses, but their bodies were covered in hard, shiny skin. The mouths of these creatures were full of sharp, razor-like teeth, and from beneath their glowing red eyes flickered with malice. From their tentacles, suction cups attached to the ceiling occasionally detached, creating the repulsive sound we heard from outside. Hundreds of such creatures moved along the ceiling, creating the illusion of a living, pulsating mass, which further intensified our horror. The air in the room was cold and damp, and every step we took echoed, seemingly awakening even more creatures. At that moment, one of the Titans, without hesitation, took action. He armed himself with a flamethrower and, with cold calmness, began spraying streams of fire around the room. Bright tongues of flame illuminated the walls, reflecting off the damp stone masonry and scorching the monstrous octopuses, which fell to the ground in agony, emitting horrifying sounds. We stood aside, watching this saving but terrifying sight. Occasionally, we fired shots, killing those creatures that tried to escape outside. When half of them had already been destroyed, something unexpected happened. The remaining part broke away from the ceiling and lunged at the Titan. It seemed to anticipate this and directed a stream towards them. But still, a large number fell on him, sinking their teeth into him. He remained calm. His protective scales saved him from any damage. I heard that they're made from the skin of some creature grown in our agency. Then I remembered I was dressed in regular army fabric, and I thought to ask for such gear myself. Meanwhile, the creatures tried to devour him, and another warrior with a flamethrower intervened. He aimed it at his comrade and doused him with a fiery stream. All the creatures burned and fell to the ground. The first agent stood as if nothing had happened. It seemed like the fire had no effect on him. I felt an even stronger desire to have that kind of suit. After we wiped out those creatures, we explored the remaining rooms, but found nothing. So we decided to return to the intersection and explore the second passage. As we proceeded along it, we found ourselves in a vast crypt where darkness seemed almost tangible. The space was filled with thousands of graves, laid out in endless, grim symmetry. Each tomb was neatly marked, but the inscriptions on the stone slabs were barely discernible, worn away by time and humidity. We slowly walked along these grim rows, hearing only the sound of our footsteps echoing in the cold air of this dismal place. The air was heavy and damp, tainted with the smell of decay and old mold. The dim light from our flashlights barely penetrated the dense darkness, creating long shadows that seemed alive. The underground chamber resembled an unfinished painting by an old master, depicting a vision of sorrow and decay. Rustles and strange sounds emanating from unexplored corners of the crypt made us flinch and turn. But there was nothing there except shadows and darkness. Sometimes it felt like unknown creatures could leap out at us from behind each tomb. The echo of our footsteps and the whispers of our voices reverberated off the walls of the crypt, creating the impression that someone was whispering back. The nervous tension grew with every meter we traversed, compounded by a sense of inevitability and oblivion awaiting us in the depths of this gloomy place. As soon as we passed the rows of graves, the ground suddenly trembled beneath our feet. Moments later, a creature erupted from one of the tombs with an explosion. A ghoul, an embodiment of terror, burst forth from its underground lair, hurling bones and earth in all directions. It was the same creature I had seen before. It immediately launched into an attack. Chester quickly drew a pair of pistols hidden beneath his cloak and began firing at the assailant. Bullets crackled through the air, but the ghoul evaded them with astonishing agility, using the darkness and nearby graves as cover. Neil, having dodged aside at the first attack, also opened fire. He aimed and fired in bursts, trying to anticipate the ghoul's movements. However, the creature, despite its clumsiness, was incredibly fast and seemed to anticipate the trajectory of the bullets. The battle unfolded with incredible intensity. The ghoul didn't just evade. It attacked, darting out of the darkness to deliver swift blows then retreating among the graves. This creature was no ordinary undead. Its movements were calculated and cunning. It used the landscape of the crypt, maneuvering among the graves and old stone slabs to gain advantage. The Titans spread out to cover more ground and limit the ghoul's maneuverability. Chester signaled to the rest of the group, coordinating their actions, trying to encircle the ghoul or lure it into open space. The tension in the air reached its peak as the ghoul, realizing it was trapped, launched into one final attack. At that moment, Neil, seizing the element of surprise, managed to precisely shoot one of the ghoul's less protected areas. The bullet hit the creature's neck, causing it to slow down. Seizing the opportunity, Chester made several well-placed shots, each finding its mark. Injured and weakened, the ghoul finally fell, no longer able to rise. We, catching our breath, cautiously approached the fallen enemy, ensuring that the threat had been neutralized. The smell of gunpowder and adrenaline lingered in the air, and our hearts still raced from the tension we had just experienced. I breathed a sigh of relief. It had been a truly tense battle. Apparently, this creature emerged in this crypt due to the abundance of graves. We hadn't yet figured out where they come from, so the body needed to be preserved. One of the agents pulled out a special bag, human-sized, and we packed the remains of this creature into it. For now, we'll leave it here, and then we'll come back. Continuing our journey through the gloomy catacombs, we soon came across a monumental obelisk carved from dark stone. On its surface were engraved ancient symbols and an inscription that read, "Catacombs of the Martyrs." The words evoked a sense of grandeur and tragedy, reminding us of those who were buried here many centuries ago. What could it mean? There was no further description. After inspecting every corner of the place, we found nothing of interest and finally decided to proceed to the third passage. As we entered it, we saw a red glow ahead. Soon, we emerged into a vast cavern, in the center of which was a large lake. It was emitting this red glow. Approaching closer, I leaned down to look at the water. It seemed transparent but tinged with a red hue, while the glow emanated from the bottom. We looked around. It was impossible to bypass this water obstacle. But soon, we spotted a small pier where a boat was docked, with an angel bust at the bow. Neil said it seemed we needed to cross to the other side on it. Slowly and cautiously, we boarded the boat, which barely rocked on the surface of the huge red glowing lake. The light emanating from its depths enveloped us in a soft but ominous glow, creating the impression that the water was filled with something mystical and ancient. Neil, taking the oar, began to row slowly, disturbing the silence with the light splashing of water. The rest of us followed his lead, trying to maintain balance and not disrupt the fragile stability of the boat. Silence reigned around us, interrupted only by the sounds of our oars and the faint echo bouncing off the towering walls of the cavern. As we crossed the lake, I noticed an unusual movement beneath the surface of the water. At first, it seemed like just a shadow or an illusion caused by the strange light. But the shadow quickly grew in size and took the form of a long serpentine creature smoothly gliding beneath our boat. God, not again. Is there some kind of wildlife lurking in every corner here? Before we could react in any way, a huge creature erupted from the water with a crash and splash, resembling a salamander. Its body was covered in slick, shiny scales, glowing red from the lake's light. The creature's eyes, cold and calculating, cast a scorching gaze upon us, while its wide-open mouth gleamed with 2 rows of razor-sharp teeth. The salamander struck the side of our boat with force, trying to overturn it. Neil, keeping his composure, attempted to push it away with the oar, but the creature was too fast and agile, twisting and evading the blows. In the midst of the struggle, as the salamander attacked again, our boat began to tilt, threatening to capsize. I, trying to regain balance, leaned sharply to the opposite side, but this action only worsened the situation. Seizing the moment, the salamander attacked again, this time aiming straight at me. Acting instinctively, Chester fired at the attacking creature. The loud gunshot echoed through the cave, and the bullet hit the salamander's side, eliciting an angry and painful cry. The creature recoiled into the water but soon resurfaced, trying to overturn our boat again. We all held onto the boat's sides tightly, trying to maintain balance. Neil, recovering from the initial shock, grabbed the oar and struck the salamander on the head with force. The creature howled in pain and backed off, but its attacks grew more aggressive. At that moment, another salamander emerged from the water, unnoticed until now. Now the struggle intensified with renewed vigor. Desperately fighting for our lives, we opened fire from all weapons. Chester, holding a pistol in one hand, used the other to steady the boat, while shooting at the attacking salamanders. One of the shots hit the creature's eye, causing it to retreat with a piercing shriek. Every second of this battle felt like an eternity. The tension reached its peak as the salamanders, mustering their last strength, simultaneously attacked the boat from both sides, trying to overturn it. Together, we all lunged to the opposite sides of the boat, trying to balance it and avoid disaster. It was a struggle not only against the creatures but also against the watery element itself. However, despite our efforts, one of the salamanders managed to wedge its powerful jaws under the boat's edge. Together we made one final determined push, and using a distracting maneuver, Chester and Neil simultaneously attacked the creature from different sides. Neil jabbed the remainder of the broken oar into the salamander's side, while Chester fired at the vulnerable spot under its chest. With a groan and an agonizing wail, the salamanders retreated, disappearing into the murky depths of the lake. Shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline, we slowly continued our journey to the other shore. Approaching the dock, we were all grateful for the opportunity to set foot on solid ground. Wow, what awaits us next? It feels like we've stumbled into some dungeon crawling with all sorts of creatures. After catching our breath from the tense journey across the lake, we continued on our path and soon found ourselves in a long corridor, its walls adorned with frescoes and inscriptions carved into the stone. These finely crafted images and texts represented a true artistic legacy frozen in time. Chester, with his experience and knowledge of history and mythology, began to carefully study the frescoes and inscriptions. He soon found key information about the figure occupying a central place in the images and texts. It was a demon vampire named Marbaciel, known for his thirst for human blood. According to the inscriptions, Marbaciel was a powerful creature whose actions led to numerous human casualties. The history described how angels and their devoted followers engaged in a battle with the demon to put an end to his atrocities. These battles were depicted on the frescoes with magnificent detail, showing angels descending from heaven to confront Marbaciel. In the end, after a long and exhausting struggle, the angels and their followers managed to defeat Marbaciel and imprison him in these catacombs. The inscriptions warned that if Marbaciel ever broke free from his confinement, he would unleash a plague upon humanity, leading to its inevitable demise. Chester shared this information with us, and we realized with alarm that the place we were in held a huge threat. The inscription also contained a warning and a call for caution, pointing out the safety measures that needed to be followed to avoid awakening the demon. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, we decided to continue moving, but with even greater caution, examining every corner for possible traps or mechanisms. Continuing our journey through the dark catacombs, we finally reached a place that Chester called the Cursed Crypt. This section of the underground was particularly ominous. The air here was saturated with a thick, almost palpable sense of evil and a premonition of death. The crypt was large, its stone walls adorned with Gothic arches and carved frescoes depicting scenes of vampire hunting and destruction. In the center of the room stood a grim pillar to which the body of a vampire was nailed. The vampire was dressed in tattered remnants of what once was his attire, his gaunt features dimly glowing, expressing eternal agony. His hands and feet were bound with thick, rusty chains, and a large wooden stake was driven into his heart. A grim glow emanated from beneath his closed lids, and it seemed that every detail in this place whispered of his torments and the evil he once sowed. The walls of the crypt were adorned with spells and ritual symbols designed to keep the vampire in a state of eternal confinement. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere was only interrupted by a faint draft that swept through the crypt, causing the flames of the candles to flicker in a chaotic dance of shadows. It was at this moment that we noticed the first signs of awakening. Slowly, barely discernible movements began to appear in the vampire's fingers. His eyes twitched slightly under his lids, and the glow around his body became more intense, as if an internal force had begun to fill his long, dormant body again. In the tense silence, each of our breaths seemed loud and sharp. We involuntarily stepped back, realizing that we must be extremely cautious. Understanding that the vampire could break free at any moment and once again pose a threat to the world, made us vigilant and prepared for any developments. But what were we to do next? Drive another stake? At that moment, Chester pulled out the book wrapped in cloth from his bag, and looking at the vampire, he began to read. His voice, initially calm and confident, gradually filled with power. It sounded like an ancient resonance, echoes of which reverberated along the walls of the crypt. At that moment, the vampire suddenly snapped his eyes open. They emitted a malicious red glow, and he let out a piercing scream so powerful that it stirred up a huge gust of wind in response. Whirlwinds of wind swept through the corridors, stirring up dust and small stones, but Chester continued to read. With each word of the incantation, the vampire became more and more frantic. He made a gesture with his hand, and his eyes flashed even brighter with red light. With words that sounded like an ancient and forgotten language, ghouls began to materialize out of the void. These creatures, semi-decomposed, with rotting flesh and a thirst for blood, moved towards us to protect their master. Our group quickly armed ourselves and prepared to repel the attack. Neil and I, armed with rifles, opened fire on the approaching creatures. The echoes of gunfire reverberated through the dark corridors of the crypt, with each volley carrying the hope of stopping the undead before they could reach Chester. I, holding a pistol, aimed and fired at the nearest ghouls, trying to prevent them from getting too close to our defensive circle. Bullets whistled through the air, embedding themselves in the decaying flesh of our enemies, causing them to retreat or fall lifeless onto the cold stone floor. Meanwhile, the Titans, members of our group equipped with flamethrowers, joined the fray. Jets of fire erupted from their weapons, engulfing the space in front of us and turning ghouls into living torches. The stench of burning flesh filled the air, and the groans and cries of the burning creatures created a horrifying symphony of terror. The entire battle was filled with chaos, where every shot and every stream of fire brought us closer to victory or defeat. The ghouls, although weakened by our fire, continued to advance, trying to break through our line of defense. When they got too close, the Titans took them on in hand-to-hand combat. Meanwhile, Chester, standing in the center of the circle, continued to read the spell with incredible concentration. His voice grew louder and more insistent. The light emanating from his book began to flicker more strongly, forming a protective barrier around us. Every word he uttered was a blow to the enemy forces, and gradually, the ghouls began to lose their strength and power. When the last of the ghouls fell, engulfed in the fiery inferno of the flamethrowers, the vampire realized that it was the end. Then something unexpected happened. He let out a furious scream, and his head detached from his body. 8 spider-like legs emerged from where his neck had been, and in the place where his head connected to his neck, hundreds of small spores dangled. It seemed as if they were insect eggs by the thousands. The vampire's head leaped and skillfully landed on the ceiling, then ran along it towards the exit. Meanwhile, his body, suspended on the pillar, began to dry up right before our eyes. The situation unfolded so swiftly that we barely had time to comprehend what was happening. The vampire's head, now possessing monstrous spider-like legs, quickly moved along the catacomb ceiling, dodging our shots with incredible agility and speed. Chester, shouting a cry, led us in pursuit, and we ran after it, dispersing the darkness with the light of our flashlights. The pursuit was filled with adrenaline. The air in the catacombs corridors became heavy and dense from the shooting and panic. The vampire's head eluded us like a ghost flickering ahead, disappearing at one of the numerous turns, and then reappearing before our eyes. Its movements were chaotic and unpredictable, making it difficult to hit. We ran, trying not to fall behind, overcoming obstacles such as debris-blocked sections or low-hanging arches. Our breath was heavy, and our hearts beat in unison with our rapid steps. Our shouts and the sounds of gunfire echoed through the corridors. Despite the rapid pursuit, the vampire's head still managed to elude us, making short bursts and zigzags. Its ability to move across the ceiling gave it an advantage we couldn't fully counter. Soon we found ourselves by a lake. We jumped into a boat while the head ran across the ceiling and soon disappeared from view. Chester and Neil cursed in turn, and I tried to understand what had happened as we sailed. The vampire hunter explained to me that the spores under the head could infect people, and then the vampires would proliferate across the planet. This was the very warning we had found on the frescoes. Now, under no circumstances must we let this creature get away, or it would be the end for us. When we reached the opposite shore, we rushed to the exit. We heard gunfire ahead. As we emerged from the catacombs, we saw that the remaining Titans were shooting at the head, but it dodged skillfully and jumped outside. We chased after it. But suddenly, Neil stopped abruptly. I asked him what was wrong, but he frowned, pondering something. Then he said, "If you think about it, where would this creature go if it wanted to spread these spores faster? They couldn't be airborne, so it needed water. That means we should head to the water treatment station." And indeed, since we had already lost it, we needed to anticipate its moves and pray that our guess was correct. Arriving at the site, we found the station to seem calm, and nothing indicated the presence of the monster. However, we did not relax. Quickly surveying the area, we chose strategic positions for an ambush. Neil and Chester took positions on the roof of one of the station buildings to oversee and control the surrounding area. I and the remaining Titans positioned ourselves near the main entrances and exits of the water treatment facilities, ready to open fire at any moment. We set traps and used night vision cameras to monitor movement. Each of us was armed and ready for battle. Our strategy was aimed at immediately reacting in case the vampire appeared and preventing it from achieving its sinister goals. As we waited, the tension grew. The air was cool, and a light breeze carried the sounds of the night. Time dragged slowly, each rustle making us strain our ears and grip our weapons tighter. Chester occasionally updated us on the situation through the radio, keeping our combat readiness. Suddenly, the motion sensors activated on one of the station's flanks. Chester signaled over the radio, and we all immediately focused on the source of the alarm. Shadows slipped between the buildings, and the next moment, the vampire's head, still agile and fast, appeared from around the corner. Neil opened fire, trying to stop it before it could enter the building. The head dodged the bullets with amazing agility and tried to escape in another direction, but the Titans, armed with flamethrowers, created a barrier of fire blocking its path. The head jumped back, trying to find another route, but at that moment Chester, descending from the roof, finally cut off its path, firing several accurate shots from his rifle. The vampire head, besieged from all sides, desperately searched for a way to escape. The Titan's flamethrowers created a wall of flame, forcing the creature to bounce back each time it tried to break through. Chester, using his high position and shooting experience, fired volley after volley trying to stun or wound the monster, but it still dodged with incredible agility. At that moment, I decided to take matters into my own hands. Grabbing a specially prepared bomb designed to fight such creatures, I crept closer. The head momentarily focused on the other team members, distracted by a new burst of flame, and that was all I needed. With maximum precision, I tossed the bomb right at it, aiming at the spot where it had previously been attached to the body. The bomb activated immediately upon hitting the surface, and the explosive wave filled the air with the sound of cracking and screeching. A bright flash of light illuminated the night darkness, and the head, caught in the epicenter of the explosion, was finally destroyed. After the head exploded, a bright red flash lit up the sky. The explosion blinded me for a moment, and when I could open my eyes again, I found myself in an entirely different place. It was something akin to space. A boundless, star-filled expanse with neither ground beneath my feet nor sky above. In this timeless space hovered a terrifying creature resembling a demon. This demon looked like a leech, but had arms and legs, making it even more sinister. Its red eyes glowed with evil thirst, and its long, writhing limbs stretched toward me, as if trying to grab and drag me into the abyss. I felt that this was the end, and I experienced a cold horror of impending fate. But then I felt some wind, a warm and soothing breeze that suddenly began to blow on my face and hands. Turning around, I saw behind me a radiance, shining brighter than 1,000 suns. From this light emerged wings, illuminated so brightly that I could not discern who or what was the source of this light. The appearance of this radiance clearly stunned the demon. It faltered, its limbs freezing in the air, and its red eyes momentarily lost their malevolent gleam. Using this chance, I took a deep breath and closed my eyes, gathering strength. When I opened my eyes again, I was lying on the floor near the water treatment station. My comrades leaned over me, concernedly examining my condition. The air around was full of the smell of ozone and char from the explosion, which apparently had transported me to that strange reality. I tried to stand up, still feeling the aftertaste of that unusual wind and light that had saved me from the inevitable. Now, having come to my senses, I told my comrades about my vision, and we all looked at each other, understanding that perhaps some higher power had helped us. But who or what it was remained only a guess. Chester pondered my words as if guessing whom I might have met. I also had speculations about where all these creatures on our planet might come from. Maybe someday we'll be able to uncover the truth, but for now, I was glad to have survived.